Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for the warm introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful and important venue with you all today. Thanks to DocP for organising this opportunity for us all to come together and discuss the cultural boycott of Israel and the relationship of art to popular struggles for freedom and justice. The Art, Solidarity and Palestine initiative sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm really looking forward to learning and sharing with you all more about that today and in the future too. So there are a number of important anniversaries. I should probably mention at the beginning. Today is also the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This month also marks 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, which I'm sure you know was the document that announced the UK government's support for the colonisation of Palestine 100 years ago, and it laid the ground for the Nakba catastrophe, which was what we now call ethnic cleansing. It was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which never ended. It's still happening today in Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, and throughout the West Bank, and throughout historic Palestine. The Nakba began at the end of 1947, so 70 years ago. It's also 50 years since the start of the military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And this year also marks 10 years of the brutal siege of Gaza. So, given the significance of all of those dates, it's even more important that we're here together today to discuss these initiatives. So, what I'm going to do is going to talk about some of the arguments, some of the counter-arguments around the cultural boycott of Israel. And we should have some time for some questions at the end. So, I'll start off by saying that Israel's ongoing dispossession of Palestinians, trampling of human rights, the entrenchment of apartheid, is only possible with the support and complicity of of powerful governments. The US, the UK, the EU, and so it's this impunity that the BDS movement seeks to challenge. Despite these decades of displacement and dispossession, Palestinians do continue to resist, demanding no more or no less than our full rights under international law. So the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, as you know, was founded in 2005 by the absolute majority of Palestinian civil society, bringing together disparate boycott initiatives under a Palestinian leadership. Now, the PACBI call, PACBI is the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. That call came a year earlier, and PACBI is a founding member of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, the Palestinian leadership of the global BDS movement. So PACBI is a founding member. It's a fundamental part of the BNC, the BDS National Committee. BDS is a powerful tool of solidarity, and it's the most effective way to challenge international complicity in Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights. And it is a rights-based movement rather than a solution-based movement. So sidestepping the one-state or two-state debate, what the BDS movement is doing is calling for Palestinian human rights under international law. Now, I'm guessing everyone knows the three aims of the BDS movement. Does anyone want to?
Yes, do expand on that.
The first is, so the BDS movement has three very clear aims. So we're demanding at a minimum the end of the occupation of all Arab lands since 1967, including Syrian territory, the occupied Golan Heights, and the dismantling of the apartheid wall. The second demand is equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, such as me and my family, who are subject to systematic racist discrimination. There's at least 60 laws that you can look up on the Adala database that are explicitly discriminatory on the basis of ethnicity. And the third key aim of the BDS movement is promoting and respecting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and land from which they were ethnically cleansed, starting in 1947. So, that's a kind of general intro to BDS, the BDS movement, and to PACBI call. So the PACBI call, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic Cultural Boycott of Israel, is a call for the boycott of complicit Israeli institutions. So we're going to talk more about that, but it's, as you know, it's an institutional boycott, not an individual boycott. We are going to come back to that. It's important to know that. So the logic behind it, what we're saying is that cultural institutions in Israel are actually integral, like a fundamental part of the scaffolding or the framework of apartheid. So what does that mean? It means that either through silence or, in fact, in many cases, active participation, Israeli cultural and academic institutions are fully complicit in Israel's occupation and apartheid. The Palestinian call for the boycott of Israel should have particular resonance in the West, as our governments here are incomparably complicit in Israel's settler colonial system of racist oppression. So this puts a huge burden of responsibility onto Western civil society. Western civil society has an extremely significant role to play, and this very much extends to artists and to cultural institutions. At this point, I'd like to share with you a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the veteran anti-apartheid leader. He said in 2010, "Just as we said during apartheid that it was inappropriate for international artists to perform in South Africa in a society founded on discriminatory laws and racial exclusivity, so it would be wrong for Cape Town Opera to perform in Israel." I mean, that's no coincidence that Desmond Tutu is advocating for the cultural boycott there, and he does so consistently. In fact, he signed the open letter along with dozens of other artists and political figures addressed to Radiohead recently. And many veteran apartheid activists and leaders and figures have and continue to strongly advocate for the cultural boycott of Israel, including Ronnie Casrills, who actually signed the open letter to Nick Cave as well. A couple of other things to mention. We've got some colleagues and friends from Artists for Palestine here. So in the UK, almost 1,300 artists have now signed a pledge to uphold the cultural boycott of Israel. When it's launched, it was around 700, I believe, and that number's almost doubled since then in the last couple of years. I'm sure Naomi will be telling you more about that later. In the US, over 1,000 Black American artists, academics, and activists endorsed BDS in a 2015 letter. And indeed, the Black Lives Matter movement and its umbrella organisation, the Movement for Black Lives, has also endorsed BDS, including, of course, the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And there's other similar initiatives around the world, Canada, Ireland, and a few other places too. And for me, these noble acts of solidarity are deeply, deeply moving. And a little later, I'm also going to discuss a little bit more about the hope and how powerful that is as a concept and as a tool of solidarity. So what I've outlined here are some of the sort of fundamentals of some of the logic and the sort of rationale of the boycott. Towards the end, I'll be happy to take any questions, go back over some of those ideas. Kind of wanted to run through some of the counter-arguments, because we have the theory, we have the application of the boycott, and in the application, if you're speaking to an artist or to an artistic institution, you're going to come up against a whole series of counter-arguments, which I'm sure many of you are already aware, and it is the same arguments every time, and it's important to kind of go through those to discuss kind of our responses to those. But frankly, you know, some arguments are slightly tougher to take apart than others, but quite frankly, I'm yet to hear a very compelling counter-argument against the cultural boycott of Israel, but we'll go through some of them now. One of the sort of key counter-arguments would be freedom of expression, so freedom of artistic expression, freedom of academic expression. So I mean, there's a lot of ways to respond to that sort of argument. I mean, excuse me. One is for who? For who? Whose freedom of expression are we discussing here? We're not discussing Palestinians' freedom of expression. And Nick Cave certainly wasn't when he spoke recently at a press conference in Jerusalem about his belief that artists who have been asked to cancel shows in Tel Aviv were actually being silenced or censored. Now, he's not talking about Palestinian artists, of course, who are silenced and censored on a daily basis, along with all Palestinians living under occupation and apartheid. And Reddy had made a similar argument as well, and I believe it was the director Mike Lee who responded with a kind of version of what I've just outlined there. It's freedom of expression, but who exactly? When Tom York from Radiohead spoke of it. Another thing to note is that the academic and cultural boycott of Israel does not target individuals, as its guidelines and track records show beyond any doubt whatsoever. It's an institutional boycott, as we mentioned already, and it's grounded and consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at this point, I'm going to read a quote from the guidelines. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't before, or even if you have, to read or reread the guidelines for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. It's two separate documents, one for the academic, one for the cultural boycott. As a great deal of the logic underpinning the cultural and academic boycotts is actually contained in those guidelines, so I would encourage you to familiarise yourself with those guidelines. I'm just going to read a short quote here. So this is from the cultural boycott guidelines. Anchored in precepts of international law and universal human rights, the BDS movement, including PACBI, rejects on principle boycotts of individuals based on their identity, such as citizenship, race, gender or religion, or opinion. Mere affiliation of Israeli cultural workers to an Israeli cultural institution is therefore not grounds for applying the boycott. If, however, an individual is representing the State of Israel or a complicit Israeli institution, or is commissioned or recruited to participate in Israel's efforts to rebrand itself, then their activities are subject to the institutional boycott the BDS movement is calling for. So at this point, it's really worth thinking about how the Palestinian call for cultural boycott of Israel is similar and was inspired by the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the cultural boycott of that regime. There's a key difference, which is that the South African boycott was a blanket ban. So by the 80s, and indeed before, but it really gathered pace by that time, of course, any white South African artists who would be touring around the rest of the world would find themselves subject to a boycott. Excuse me. So it was a blanket ban based on identity. We don't do that with the cultural boycott of Israel. It's institutional and it's nuanced, and it doesn't target individuals as such. It can only target individuals if they've kind of set themselves up contractually or otherwise to actually represent the State of Israel and its policy goals. So when people sort of reply to say, oh, I don't support cultural boycotts, I think you should always respond really to arguments like that with the asking if they would have advocated against the cultural boycott of South Africa, which of course was successful. It played a key role in ending apartheid. Many different geopolitical forces, of course, that also played a role. I think the South Africa analogy is absolutely fundamental when you're discussing the cultural boycott. So why the double standard when it comes to Israel is the question. It's also worth mentioning that the BDS movement is opposed on principle to blacklisting or political testing. Excuse me. We've got some coughs, please. Another thing to mention is, I always forget the state, maybe someone here can remember. There was a US state recently that tabled anti-trans rights laws, and a number of artists, including Bruce Springsteen, actually cancelled, they boycotted that state, North Carolina?
North Carolina, yeah.
So again, why should Israel be exempt from a cultural boycott? There's no specific reason why any state or any country shouldn't be subject to a cultural boycott, which of course is a tactic, not a principle. And it was successful in South Africa, and it can be successful in Palestine, and it's proving to be so. I'd like to read out another quote at this point. I love this quote. It's Anuga Esredi, who was the director of the UN Centre Against Apartheid in 1984, responded to criticism that the cultural boycott of South Africa infringed on freedom of expression. He said, "It's rather strange, to say the least, that the South African regime, which denies all freedoms to the African majority, should become a defender of the freedom of artists and sportsmen of the world." Excuse me, gosh. Great time to get a cold. This is the bit I really like. "We have a list of people who have performed in South Africa because of ignorance of the situation, or the law of money, or unconcern over racism. They need to be persuaded to stop entertaining apartheid, to stop profiting from apartheid money, and to stop serving the propaganda purposes of the apartheid regime." But can art transcend politics? This is an argument you often hear. Again, there's lots of ways to respond to this. I would say simply, there is no song loud enough to bring down Israel's illegal apartheid war. Thank you. There's no song loud enough to bring down an 8-metre apartheid wall. There's no artwork beautiful enough to move Israel's leaders to accept and respect Palestinian humanity. Okay, hopefully I can get through the rest of this without talking too much. Did everybody see the news about Nick Cave recently?
Yes.
So he's the Australian musician and writer who recently performed 2 shows in Tel Aviv, ignoring widespread calls from Palestinians, from fellow artists, from Israelis, to respect the Palestinian boycott picket line. He totally ignored those calls and then called a press conference in Jerusalem, I think it was, where he complained that artists were being censored and silenced. And by that he meant privileged Western artists such as himself. The idea, of course, that anyone can silence or censor a millionaire rock star by signing an open letter is a pretty kind of absurd claim, pretty easy to take apart on its own terms. There were a number of responses to Nick Cave's comments. I want to read you a response from PACBI. So PACBI said, "Nick Cave's performances in Tel Aviv and recent statement are a propaganda gift to Israeli apartheid. Betraying his progressive values, Nick Cave will play Tel Aviv, ignoring how his gig will help to artwash Israel's decades-old oppression of Palestinians. Oblivious to Israel's siege of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, as well as ethnic cleansing in settlements in occupied Jerusalem, Cave is crossing the non-violent picket line drawn by Palestinians. Nonetheless, we thank Nick Cave for making one thing abundantly clear. Playing Tel Aviv is never simply about music. It is a political and moral decision to stand with the oppressor against the oppressed." Similarly, Radiohead said that what they said was that they don't endorse Trump any more than they endorse Netanyahu, but they still play in the US. There's a number of responses to that. Obviously, no one has called for a boycott of the US. The Trump regime does not loudly celebrate performances by British rock bands when they come to play in New York. But kind of most significantly, Radiohead said that they don't endorse the Israeli regime, but the Israeli regime absolutely endorsed Radiohead. And they did, again, with Nick Cave. So there have been dozens of tweets from the Israeli government itself, from lobby groups, the managing editor of the Jerusalem Post, which is the Israeli newspaper that's seen as the closest to the military and security establishment in Israel, described Tom York of Radiohead's comments as the best Hasbara propaganda that Israel has received recently. Gilad Erdan, who is Israel's anti-BDS minister, who uses black ops and a multi-million-dollar budget to attack human rights defenders, he said, "We salute Radiohead." An Israeli foreign ministry spokesperson said, "Bravo Nick Cave for resisting BDS." So, and this, maybe Naomi might be talking about it a bit more. You can find two posts on the Artists for Palestine website, one on Nick Cave, one on Radiohead, where they've compiled these tweets. And I think those two pieces are an absolutely crucial rebuff to many different arguments that you hear, particularly from artists, like, oh, the state doesn't care about these performances, or it's apolitical to go and do these things. Any number of sort of counter-arguments can actually be kind of rebuffed by the very clear documented evidence that we have now of Israeli government support for such performances. This is all in the context of Brand Israel, which was Israel's response to the BDS movement, which is an intentional and overt policy of art washing human rights violations. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention as well, but I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time today. And the coughing has kind of added a few extra minutes. But a few other things I wanted to mention. Actually, well, stay on Brand Israel for a minute. One foreign ministry official said, launching the Brand Israel campaign in 2005, "We see culture as a Hasbara tool of the first rank and do not differentiate between Hasbara and culture." And in 2009, another top foreign ministry official said, "We will send well-known novelists and writers overseas. Theatre companies, exhibits. This way you show Israel's prettier face." Another key or common counter-argument is that a boycott of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. I'd like to just quote Judith Butler, the philosopher and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. She said, "Only if we accept the proposition that the State of Israel is the exclusive and legitimate representative of the Jewish people would a movement calling for divestment, sanction and boycott against that state be understood as directed against the Jewish people as a whole. Israel would then be understood as coextensive with the Jewish people. There are two major problems with this view. First, the State of Israel does not represent all Jews, and not all Jews understand themselves as represented by the State of Israel. Secondly, the State of Israel should be representing all of its population equally, regardless of whether or not they are Jewish, regardless of race, religion or ethnicity." I'll say a quick word about dialogue. Any number of historical examples will tell you that reconciliation and dialogue come after the implementation of justice, after the fall of apartheid. That was true of South Africa, that's true of Northern Ireland, and it's true of Palestine. And the BDS movement is not opposed to dialogue per se. It's in favour of ethical dialogue, which recognises the inherent power disparity between occupier and occupied. Thank you for bearing with me while my throat gives up on me. So just to wrap up before we do some questions. Palestinians are asking international artists and institutions to at least do no harm to our struggle for self-determination if they can do no good. So this means not undermining and crossing our boycott picket line. For Palestinians, the BDS movement represents hope. So in doing so, we're resisting the colonisation of our minds, and for 2 million Palestinians effectively trapped in Gaza, hope is a very powerful tool in the hands of an oppressed people, for Palestinians throughout historic Palestine and in exile. And I look forward to continue to work together with you for freedom, justice and equality. Thank you.
Go ahead, sir. What do you mean by the sentence, "We cannot transcend politics"? That sounds pretty powerless.
I think you're referring to the question, can art transcend politics?
Well, a second, that is a suggestion to add to art philosophy. Because it is not only art, it is a question also of profound intellectual approach to make the link clear that the history of Europe, also the recent history of Europe, is the source of what happens in and with and by Israel. It is not just that the Western societies must come to a relief, they are the source of the problem themselves.
Fons Elders, philosopher, will be joining us in the panel debate closing up the afternoon.
Do you mind to take one or two more?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Would I be able to respond to a few questions together? Is that okay?
Sure. Other questions? Not for now. Sonia?
Yeah, just one small question. I didn't get the answer to your own question, why the double standard between the Palestinian boycott and the South African boycott.
Which is one that you run up against very frequently, of course.
Yeah. No, you asked the question, but you didn't get the answer.
Gert de Bruyne?
Yes, there is an assumption that the boycott, the cultural boycott, or the boycott, I mean, against South Africa, has been successful. There are also people who, I mean, for not so much against the boycott, but have argued against. I mean that argument that it has been successful. I mean, it has been useful in bringing down the white regime in South Africa.
Okay, so we have three fundamental questions. You have 3 minutes to respond.
Okay. I'll try to do my best. It's supposed to be a rhetorical question. This is a question I think you should respond. We should all respond when we hear someone say that they disagree with the cultural boycott of Israel. I think you should ask them. I think it's a question you need to pose back to people. Did you or would you have opposed the cultural boycott of South Africa? And if not, why the double standard? I think the answer. I've never heard an answer yet to that question, to be honest.
Oh no, I thought it was as opposed to the blanket boycott, that the question referred to blanket boycott or the smart boycott.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say with that is that, I mean, all progressive artists and all progressive artistic institutions supported the blanket cultural boycott of apartheid South Africa, but some seem reluctant to do so with the boycott of Israel, which is far more nuanced. Why is that? Which is a question I think you should pose back to people. I wasn't entirely clear on the question there about whether art can transcend politics or not. I mean, I think we have to recognise that art is powerful, and artists do have a particular power, whether they choose to use it or not. And what we're asking them to do is to not allow that power to be exploited consciously or otherwise from their point of view in the service of an apartheid regime. So, I mean, you can look at it a few different ways. You can look at it in the sense of actually art does have a particular power, whether it could be greater than politics, whether an individual artist or artwork could be greater than a whole system of racist oppression. And the answer to that's pretty clear. The question over here, Desmond Tutu was very clear about the role of the cultural boycott and what it played in struggle for apartheid South Africa. There's an interesting quote which I don't have here, but there's an interesting quote where he's discussing Tutu's discussing the academic boycott of Israel, and you can kind of sense his reluctance in a sense. But you can see also that he's clear in his mind and in his words that an academic boycott is fundamentally necessary was fundamentally necessary to their struggle. But he says something along the lines of, when apartheid falls, those will be the first links to be re-established back again. And I think that's an important way of looking at it as well.
Samir Eskanda, thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.